Welcome to Unlikely Intersections, where intent, impact, and inquiry inspire our conversations. I'm Dr. Philip Brown, and I've got my good friend, Dr. Terry Jackson here, and you are at the intersection. Today's episode inspired by a listener, our good friend, Linda Pierce.
She put a little twist on it. She says, you know what? If you and Dr. Brown had the conversation, and Dr. Brown, you would ask Dr. Brown, what if you were a black man, Dr. Brown?
Yeah, man, I tell you, as I was preparing for this conversation, it really had me doing my homework because we're talking about, as I sort of thought through, we're talking about, so I think her original question was, what if you changed and I was black and you were white for 1 year?
Yes.
And then I thought about the construct of, well, that might be difficult. So what if it was just a full reversal, right? What if it had all the factors, an upbringing, raising a family, a professional, all those things. So I don't know where we'll end up landing. You know, the first thing that came to my mind as we contemplated this topic is, well, let me understand a risk benefit, not of the show, but of the proposition. What are the risks and what are the rewards of a given proposition?
Yep.
And that just in and of itself really is informative.
It is. And, you know, I kind of thought about it from the other perspective of what are the risks and rewards, looking at it as if I were a white man or if I were white. And you and I had a little conversation back and forth about it, and I truly understand and agree with what we talked about, and we'll get into that. But as I thought about it, man, it was like, and I think I mentioned to you, I know more about what it is to be white in America, being that I've had to grow up and assimilate to white culture and white educational system just to survive in the system the way that it is, because that's truly what it is. It's an assimilation. And as some of my friends and I joke, you know, every time we go back home, there's a whole decompression that has to happen, right? Because when you're out in the world, it's like being a chameleon. The colors change, and you change to the environment that you're in, and you adapt to the environment that you're in so that you don't die an early death. And that's quite interesting, because now when I'm looking at it from the white perspective, none of that comes into play. I just think about what the advantages, you know, kind of are. And I think I mentioned to you some years ago, I said, if I were a white man in this city and I had the contacts and the network that I have, I'd be a billionaire by now. And, you know, some people will question whether or not this is even a safe conversation to have, right? Because people don't want the difficult conversations, right? They don't want the difficult collisions. You know, when you look at it from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective, you know, we're always talking about empathy. Let's think about the other person. Think about the other gender. And what we're doing today, at least we're going to attempt to do, is be the other person. And given some of the research that we've done and some of the work that you've done, I'm real comfortable having this conversation because it is one that is truly needed.
Definitely needed, and still very poorly understood in a lot of respects, I think. And, you know, the first thing I did, and I realized, for lack of a better way of saying it, I'm kind of using white rules to do this prep. How well is that going to work, right? It's like practicing baseball to play basketball.
That's right.
Really
That's right.
Doesn't necessarily translate, you know.
Right?
Because
Yes.
when I started looking through some of the other things in terms of the change that it would take if I were to become a black man, that becomes a much more difficult proposition, because it doesn't matter what sector of society I'm looking at. It is a much more upstream swim as a black man than it was for me as a white man, which is not hard for me to say, but I know it's often a difficult point of conversation for many, because our tendency is to say, but I worked hard,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know,
that's
and I
right.
did, right? But what I don't know, it's the same thing. I don't know what I don't know.
There are those double standards that kind of exist when it comes to, I'm going to say, the African American. I've never even heard anyone say he's not Chinese enough, or he's not Asian enough, he's not Latino enough. That's a phrase that kind of, as you see yourself navigating this place called America, as anyone black, that whole, you're a sellout because you speak well, you're well educated. I remember I remember growing up in Wilmington and playing basketball at the 8th Street Center. Knew a lot of guys up there, played well. The minute that I went to college and came back to play my first time, I was then reclassified as he's a college boy now. And I'm like, so what changed? And that was the perceptions amongst the guys who were playing ball there. And so that was something that I had to face as a black male. Now I'm looked at differently by my peers. And so as I made this journey to become as educated as I can, and when I finished my MBA, I asked the question, what next? And for me, the question was, well, let me earn a PhD. And it wasn't, I didn't want to earn it simply because I was looking to climb somebody's corporate ladder or even teach. The question for me is, now that I've earned this degree and I've achieved the highest degree in the land, what do I have to do next as a black man to succeed? And you had mentioned something to me, and I thought about it, and you were absolutely correct. When we first began this conversation prior to the recording, you said, there's risk to this.
Yeah, and that's where I landed, right? Because so the first thing I was really thinking about is so what and who am I putting at risk by making this change? And for me, I mean, just based on my core values, the first thing I think about actually would be my family, right? And I think about it in the context of, I have a teenage son and a teenage daughter. And I think about the context of how the world would change, what my concerns would be if my son was a young black man and my daughter was a young black woman. And that risk in and of itself would be enough for me not to do it.
Right.
Because of the risk to my son in particular, as a kid who's maybe a little bit bigger than some of the other kids, looks a little bit more mature, you translate that into what we've seen across America over the course of all time.
Yeah.
And people see this little boy as a danger to them.
Yeah.
And we know that fear creates a lot of bad behavior. Fear creates a lot of danger for people. But if I were legitimately worried about what would happen to him in a traffic stop on any given day, I don't know how I would be able to navigate that.
Right. It's interesting because even as an older male, as a black male, I still have those concerns. One of my greatest fears is going out there and being stopped by the officers for no reason whatsoever other than being black. And so when I think about it, as you thought about it from the other side, guess what? I don't have those concerns. I have a better relationship with officers simply because I'm a white male. As I think about it from a white man's perspective, I also have privilege of being favored by school authorities.
Absolutely. We see that. We can substantiate that on our Healthy Communities dashboard that we've talked about, right? Where you look at the differences in third grade reading level by race. You look at the differences in a school suspension rate, where the disparity at the time the dashboard was created was 8 to 1. So your chances of being suspended from school as a black child were 8 times what they were as a white child, which is twice the state average here in New Hanover County, by the way. But still, a state average of 4 to 1 is pretty bad anyway. So it's not confined to us, right? Like, this is a systemic problem.
That's right.
And as I contemplated the ramifications of being a black man, I was thinking, just immersed in systemic problems at every level. And there's one that is, you know, the school one.
Mm-hmm.
And we know, I mean, I cannot deny that that is true. I mean, it is in facts and figures everywhere. When I reviewed all this literature ahead of time, 150 peer-reviewed articles behind this, I mean, it's just there. I mean, the data is clear.
One of the very first questions I asked years ago about big data is, so how will big data be used to eradicate racism, bias, and prejudice? And to date, it still exists, right? But all the data, as you said, is clear. All those peer-reviewed articles you've reviewed, 150, but it doesn't appear as if we're making a lot of headway toward the eradication of it. And that's probably because it's a system, right? And there are many moving parts, you know, with this system. And another part of the school issue is I have the privilege as a white male of attending segregated schools of affluence.
You know, people forget that the original affirmative action programs in this country, which date back to the 1600s at least, are all white affirmative action.
Yes.
Whether you talk about the land grants, whether you talk about what it meant to be an indentured servant and get your freedom, whether you talk about the other little smaller land grants, you know, where it is $1 an acre for 640 acres on the first one, and then it went to $1 an acre for 320. All these things were white affirmative action. You look at the Flexner Report in the 1920s, which basically closed all but 2 of the black medical schools in the country. What we see right now, for instance, in our industry, is that this remains a profound problem. And we have peer-reviewed work coming out on a regular basis about how important it is for what's called provider concordance. And the best example I can give of that is it's very profound in OB, in obstetrics, where the studies are very clear that the outcomes for black women and children who are taken care of by a black obstetrician are much better than those taken care of by a white obstetrician. But the reverse is not true. So this is very clear. Now, what we don't know is exactly why that is. We can hypothesize on why it is. But in point of fact, there's such a profound shortage of physicians who are any other ethnicity than white, that we know we have real problems that are driving these disparities that we talk about all the time in the dashboard.
One of the questions I've always asked, and I've asked this of some high school friends, you know, what happened once we graduated from high school? We played ball together, as I like to say, we bled together, we sweated together, we cried together. And I thought those were bonds that would be kind of a lifetime kind of bonds. But what I quickly found out after graduation is all of a sudden the paths were different. And so when does the separate walk begin?
But I can say for sure when it really happened in earnest was at the moment I started medical school. And from that moment on, it was obvious to somebody who had the right eye on it, which was not me, right? Because I didn't realize it. I did not realize that all of a sudden I was living in a segregated world. It's kind of like the fish can't tell us in water.
Right.
And so as a white male, most of the people that in that peer group, as a medical student, as a medical resident, and even as a physician, were fellow white males and then white females. Just because I recognize it doesn't mean I know what it feels like, you know, and that has kind of become a theme, not just for my life in the work of equity and health equity, but a theme in life, actually. And it actually applies to a lot of other things other than race. The more I apply it, the more curious I get, the better I seem to understand. So it was a valuable experience, although certainly one that was uncomfortable.
You know, after high school, I attended a historically black college, university, North Carolina Central University. As I reflect back on it, I did have some high school friends that I played ball with who ended up over at Duke University, right across town. So we did keep in contact, and we did play tennis together and hang out because he played football, I played football, and so that relationship, you know, was there. I come back home to visit, and a good friend of mine, I buy all my tires from. You know, I go see him, and so there were some selective relationships that remain, but the masses of the relationships, for whatever reason, began a different kind of journey. And part of that goes to, I have the privilege of learning about my race in school as a white male, whereas others don't.
Yeah, and that connects two themes, right? So I know for sure that in real life, when I was in school, we didn't learn essentially anything.
Dr. King.
About history. Right. You know, we didn't learn anything about 1898,
Right.
which happened right here in our hometown.
That's right.
We didn't learn any of that stuff.
Paul Mooney, he says, everybody wants to be black, but nobody wants to be black. Meaning you want everything associated with, from the entertainment, the athletics, from the cooking, you want everything associated with black culture except the black people. And that's something that has always kind of resonated with me, right?
White culture doesn't celebrate the richness of the other cultures. We don't even really celebrate the richness of our own. That's our problem. But think about how much more robust we could be if we celebrated people's strengths. Kind of reminds me of our whole show, right? Like you're never going to hear us say, woe is me on this show.
That's right.
If you do, I want you to call us out on it.
That's right.
You know, because there's always room to maneuver. There's always room to be curious and get better. And, you know, the thing about the intersection is traffic keeps coming to it,
That's
right?
All the time.
And we have a conversation like today, and guess what? There's no answer.
That's right.
You know, we're not going to get to a resolution on what this would look like, but hopefully we've helped a few people, and we appreciate folks listening to us. And to our audience, if you want to catch up with us a little bit more, find us at unlikelyintersection.com. Look for us on YouTube, like and share. Find me at Doc Phillip Brown on LinkedIn.
You can find me, Terry Jackson, PhD, on LinkedIn. And we hope that this particular episode really provokes thought, more importantly, provokes conversation, so that we can begin to understand each other better, so that we can have the solidarity needed as a country to move forward.
Thanks for joining us today.